Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Lovely to have everybody giving up their warm evening to come to this highlights tour. The tour normally takes an hour and a half, so because we don't have to walk around the museum and up and down the stairs, we think we can try and squeeze it into an hour. The tours are normally cover 15 objects, so we've been trained to do about 30 objects. So the selection I've done tonight is some of my favourites and some other bits and pieces. I did my first highlights tour on the 30th of June 2013, so it's almost exactly the anniversary of my first one. I did my 84th tour in February last year, so this counts as my 85th highlights tour, and they're all different. They intend to cover the whole gamut of the museum's collection, both in terms of geography and chronology, so some very old things and some later things and so on. I'm trying to squeeze all this into the 60 minutes, and hopefully there might be a few minutes at the end for some questions, which Jess will mastermind, hopefully. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat or the question Q&A or wherever is easiest to put them, and we'll try and do those at the end. The British Museum, as I'm sure you all know, is the oldest museum of its type, national museum in the world, founded by Sir Hans Sloane in 1753, when he died and left his collection to the country of 65,000 objects and 80,000 objects and 65,000 works on paper. And I'm going to try and do this virtually, this tour, so I'm going to sort of pass us around the museum. And so I'm going to start by I'll just give you a plan and show you where I'm intending to go. So this is a plan of museums, not a current one. It gives you some idea. So we're going up the main steps, then up the south stairs and to the first floor, starting on the first floor, going straight up to room 42, which is now the Islamic Gallery, or part of the new Islamic galleries, and then backtracking through 41, early medieval, and 40, later medieval, round into the Money Gallery, then up the west side, looking at a couple of things on the way, and then down right up to the end for the Egyptian galleries, then down the main stairs to the Houghton Gallery, and then down to 24, down into the African galleries, up again into the North American galleries, and through into the Enlightenment Gallery 1, then quick skirt round the reading room going into the finishing the Parthenon sculptures. I'm intending to cover some of the best known pieces like the Parthenon sculptures, the Rosetta Stone and Portland vase, Sutton Hoo, Lewis chess, but some of the less well-known pieces as well. So let's hope we get most of those done. So up the main stairs, the south stairs, straight ahead into the Islamic world, so this new gallery. And on the right over here, we have an astrolabe, a large old astrolabe. Astrolabes comes from the Greek word astrolabos, star taker, and was invented by the Greeks around about 200 BC, and then developed very much in the Islamic world. This particular one seems to be made in Cairo in 1236 by a man called Abdel al-Karim al-Misri, who described himself as al-Astrolabi, the astrolabist, and al-Madrabi, the beater of metal. And it's a spectacular piece of metalwork, apart from being a brilliant astrolabe. It's made from brass with inlaid silver and copper. And apart from his own name on it, there's also an inscription of 3 rulers from Syria, Turkey, and the Caucasus called Al-Malik, Al-Muiz, and Shihab al-Din. And each one is rubbed out, so it appears that he made it for one of them, and then it was passed on to the next one. This is seen as a very important, high-quality piece. Now, astrolabes are the most amazing instruments. They're part calculator, part telescope, part clock. And in fact, it's been estimated that at their height, they could do something like 1,000 things, different things for people. I'm going to give you a close-up of the front of it, which has a star chart on it. And then you can see there's lots of different pointers. Now, most of these astrolabes had just ornamental pointers, just arrows and things. But this one, you can see, it has got fish and birds, monkeys, and leaves, and all sorts of wonderful things pointing at all these stars. And this is one of the things that makes it so interesting, so important. I'm just going to highlight one of these in particular, and this rather lovely little monkey. And here you can see the silver and copper inlay rather spectacularly on this. So we're now sort of doubling back on ourselves from the astrolabe back through the early medieval gallery, and there you can see a view of the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which dominates the whole of this gallery these days. And I'll just highlight a little bit here. You can see the wonderful silverware from the Byzantine world, which is in this particular burial. And it just about on the background, you can just make out the engraving of the ship on the back there. So this is what Sutton Hoo looks like on a nice misty morning. The land was owned, Sutton Hoo is in Suffolk, near Woodbridge, and the land was owned in the 1930s by Colonel and Mrs. Pretty. And Mrs. Pretty was widowed in 1938. She was not sure what to do with her time. One of the things she did was she invited her spiritualist friends to stay. And after one séance, one of her friends slept that night and dreamt that there were warriors buried in these mounds, some of these 18 mounds on her land, and were walking and trying to get out. So Mrs. Pretty decided to get in touch with the local archaeologist, a man called Basil Brown, and have a dig around. And the first 2 or 3 he looked at in 1938 had obviously been robbed hundreds of years before. Very disappointing. But Mrs. Pretty said, "Don't give up, I'm sure there's something there." And they went to the biggest mound, Mound 1, which is about 100 feet long, 27 meters, get the metric right. And to his surprise, this hadn't been robbed. And here we have a rather nice photograph of Mrs. Pretty with her friends up here. Probably got a thermos of coffee or something to have a look, opera glasses and notes to take, watching the excavations take place in 1939. And what they discovered was this amazing ship. Now you can see the outlines of the ship there, this 100-foot long ship, but in fact the wood had rotted away and there was no organic material at all, very little organic material had survived in this burial. You can see a sort of sand fossil, the outline of where the planks have been, and some of the rusty nails that had held it together for all those centuries. And inside, right in the middle, just here, there was the collapsed burial chamber of what's clearly a very important man. And amongst the goods they found were some spectacular Anglo-Saxon gold pieces. This is just a selection of the shield bosses. This amazing little box with a wonderful interlace on it. There's 2 or 3 or 4 snakes all twining around each other, very typical Anglo-Saxon pieces. And down here we've got a wonderful shoulder clasp with lots of inlaid garnet and millefiori glass and 2 wonderful beasts either end. And over here, a purse lid. And in the purse, there had clearly been nearly 40 coins, 37 coins and then 3 blanks. And these coins came from various Frankish mints and help us to date the burial to about the year 625, which is how we know the whole burial itself. But the star piece of this burial really is the helmet. Now, the helmet is very badly corroded. You can see the reconstruction of the remaining pieces on the left there and a modern replica of it on the right. Okay, I'll just zoom into the replica. You can see there were some wonderful beaten panels. This is the base work was made of iron, and then these panels made of tinned bronze. You can see there's figures which we call dancing warriors. There's a sort of cavalry man trampling on his enemy, and some more abstract areas as well. This was reconstructed. In fact, they had to stop the reconstruction because, as I say, it was found in 1939, and as you know, something else was happening in 1939. So it wasn't until 1951 and the Festival of Britain that the helmet was reconstructed. And they got it wrong the first time. This area just in the centre was mislabeled and in the wrong box. But if you have a look very closely at the front there, you can see here, there are 2 animals, nose to nose. On the top, there's a long serpent, a bit like the Germanic Jormungand, the world serpent curling around the world. and he's nose to nose to a dragon. And it was this bit of the dragon's head that was missing, had to be reconstructed again. And you can see his wonderful wings over the eyebrows of the face with the silver inlay. Right at the end, there's boar's heads, and then the body over the nose of the face, and then the dragon's tail forms a little moustache. So a wonderful piece of survival from the Anglo-Saxon era. Very few helmets survive from the Anglo-Saxon era. This is a remarkable one, and was worn by this warrior or king in battle to protect him when he went into battle. The eyes of these are garnets. As I said, there are lots of other garnets in the rest of the burial. And the nearest source for garnets in 625 was not Europe, it was Afghanistan. And in fact, we think these garnets may have come from Sri Lanka. So there's real global trade going on, even this early period of English history. And there are something like 4,000 garnets in this one burial. So when we sometimes call this the Dark Ages, it perhaps wasn't so dark as we thought. Now we're backtracking again, going back to room 42 for the next group of objects, another very famous set of objects from the museum's collection. This is the later medieval room, and we go into the Lewis chess sets. And this is a selection of what they look like in the case. You can see there's lots of chess pieces, some gaming pieces. One of the kings is flat on his back here, so you can see the inside of him. These pieces are made mostly from walrus tusks, morse ivory as it's called. And the reason he's on his back there is so you can see inside where little marine creatures have nibbled away inside the chess piece, or as it was inside the tusk, showing that these tusks, these walruses were not killed to make the chess set. They died natural causes, and the tusks washed up on the shore and then made by craftsmen into these pieces. It does show you, though, that even at this period, and we're talking about the 12th century now, the contacts with the rest of the world were still strong, because chess was invented in India in the 5th century and then moved across Asia, westward through Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Islamic world, and got into Europe much later on. Quite a lot of it came across during the Crusades, when there's a lot of contact, as you might imagine, between England, between Europe and Asia. It's called the Lewis chess set because it was found on the island of Lewis off the west coast of Scotland. There are a number of stories about how it's found. It's found in about 1830 by a farmer, and one of the stories he tells is that he'd had a hard day working in the fields and decided that he needed a few drinks before going home. Went to his local pub, had rather more drinks perhaps than he should have done, and got a bit drunk, decided to take a shortcut along the beach by the light of the full moon, fell over, as you may have heard people do sometimes if they have too many drinks, and he fell into what he thought was a sand dune, and it burst open. And inside, by the light of the full moon, he saw the little people, the fairies. Ran home screaming to his wife. Fortunately, she was a bit more sensible. Came back the next day, and they found these wonderful chess pieces. And you can see a selection of the chess pieces here: kings and queens, bishops, knights. These figures are called warders. What's in a modern chess set is a rook or a castle, and then these pawns. And I love the Lewis chess set, and I'm going to show you a few more details of some of these amazing pieces. And it's by looking at them, looking at their costumes, that we can actually date them. And if you see here some of the kings always on their throne with a sword. There seems to be the remains of 4 chess sets. Most of the character pieces are there, and about half the pawns. And it's because so many pawns are missing, we think this may have been a merchant stock. And the idea was you bought your character pieces and a few of the pawns, and then you made the rest of the pawns up yourself. These are the queens, some of the queens, always sitting with their hand on their face, looking rather worried. Poor old queen acting as regent as the king goes off to war. This one's got a drinking horn in her hand, which she's probably waiting for somebody to fill up. That may be why she's looking a bit glum. Bishops. Now, you didn't have bishops when chess was invented in India or in the Islamic world, and this is one of the earliest appearances of bishops in a chess set. In fact, it may even be the earliest. And they can tell the age of this because of their mitres, the pointed hats. You can see the points at front and back. before about 1150, most bishops wore their mitres with the points at the side. So these must have been after 1150. These bishops are sitting on thrones. These bishops are standing up. And here we have the knights on horseback. Usually in a modern set, it's just the horse, not the actual knight. We still call them the knights. And the warders. Here's some of the warders. In different helmets. And again, with the helmets, we can date these roughly to the 12th century. And the shields also help. The shields have these lovely patterns on, but they don't have heraldic patterns on. If they had heraldry on them, they would probably date from after 1200. So using those two dates, we can date this roughly about 1175, just before the Third Crusade. Here's some more of these warders. And you can see these ones are biting their shields. Now, this is a type of warrior called a berserker, who are famous in Scandinavian countries, in Norway and Iceland and so on. They appear in the sagas, the Icelandic sagas, as these soldiers of Odin. And the reason they're biting their shields is to get the adrenaline pumping, to get them into a frenzy to go fighting. And you can see these very simple patterns on the shields. As I say, the pawns are not people at all. They look a little bit like tombstones, and that perhaps shows you the way that peasants were thought of in the Middle Ages, fairly expendable. And here's some that's so expendable they don't even have patterns at all on them. Now, where they were made, I've already implied that in Scandinavia, but the clue to this is actually on the backs of the thrones. These are some of the king's thrones. I'll just use a little bit of detail here. You see these wonderful beasts riding around each other and biting themselves. These are very typical Scandinavian inhabited interlace, as we call it. We get them on the queens as well. You can see a couple on the queen's thrones. And the experts tell us that these are very typical of the Trondheim area of Norway. So it's thought that these are probably made in Trondheim or nearby, around about 1175, and then somehow got to the island of Lewis. Just finish off with this rather nice slide to the warders. It's thought that the merchant perhaps bought these, set sail, hoping to sell these to some rich customers, perhaps in Ireland or in the west of England, and they stopped at Lewis. Perhaps the ship was wrecked and these were buried by accident. My favourite theory, though, is that they had to stop on Lewis, perhaps because of bad weather or because they needed supplies. And he heard there was a good pub nearby, so he buried these for safekeeping in the sand and drank so much he'd forgotten where he buried them, and that's why they were left there. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the other nice story I like about these is you can see they're on a red and white checkerboard. People often ask when we do these tours, how can you tell the difference? Which is the black side and which is the white side? Most modern chess sets have black and white chess pieces. Well, when these were found in 1830, some of them had red paint on them. So we think they're actually a red and white set, and that's why museums put it on a red and white checkerboard. And that gives me quite a nice anecdote. In 1999, I think it was, a film came out called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which I think some of you may have heard of. And Warner Brothers realised they had a huge hit on their hands. And one of the scenes in that shows the Lewis chessmen. So they brought out their own version of the Lewis chess set, did their research, brought them out as red and white. At the time, I remember checking the British Museum shop, and the British Museum only had the black and white version. So Warner Brothers filmmakers were historically more accurate than the British Museum, which is not something to be proud of, I suppose. Right, we're now going into the money gallery, and towards the end of the money gallery, we have this suffragette penny, as it's called. Now you can see this is a fairly ordinary penny, dated 1903, from the reign of King Edward VII, and there's the King's face on it, but it's been vandalised. You can see somebody has taken a fairly crude set of punches and hammered votes for women into it. Now we don't know who did this, he or she, probably was never caught, and there's not that many done. That's been quite difficult to do, and they all seem to be done around about 1913, 1914, when the struggle for votes for women was getting more and more violent, and more protests and people getting caught and going to prison. And the British Museum actually has its own suffragette story, which is quite interesting. In April 1914, a lady calling herself Mary Stuart, her real name Clara Mary Lambert, came into the museum with her normal Edwardian clothes and with a hatchet hidden in her sleeve, And when she got to the Asiatic room, she took the hatchet out, shouting, "Votes for women," smashed a case containing 3 Chinese porcelain cups and a saucer. She was arrested, put in prison for a couple of months, went on hunger strike, was released under the cat and mouse legislation, hoping to catch her again, and she disappeared. But a month later, in May 1914, 2 other suffragettes came in, Nellie Hay and Addie Wheeler, with their concealed weapons, and they headed to the Egyptian Gallery and smashed one of the mummy cases. Now, fortunately, they were arrested before they could actually smash the mummy as well. They're put in prison, went on hunger strike, released under cat and mouse, and so on, the usual story. But the museum got a bit worried about this, and 2 days after their attack, they issued a notice saying that unaccompanied women could only enter the galleries if they had a note saying that they had a satisfactory recommendation from a person willing to be responsible for their behaviour. By that, they presumably meant a man, a responsible citizen like a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer, something like that. And as far as I know, they've never actually rescinded that notice, so be careful if you're an unaccompanied woman going to the museum and looking at this case. We're now going round the corner into the northern section of the gallery, going into room 70, which is called Rome, City and Empire, where we've got the Warren Cup and the Portland vase. Now, we do both of these on the tour, but I'm only going to talk about the Portland vase today, the one on the right, this wonderful glass, cameo glass vase. In its example, it's probably the finest surviving example of Roman cameo glass and dates to the very early part of the 1st century AD, the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And it's called the Portland vase after the Margaret, the Duchess of Portland, who I shall come to in a moment. The technique of making cameo glass is quite difficult. Actually, I'll go to the next slide so you can see a bit more detail. It's 2 colours of glass, as you can see. In this case, it's dark blue and white. And you do this by blowing your inner glass, the blue glass, nearly to its full size. And while it's still hot, you dip it into the other glass, the white glass here, up to just the shoulder, as you can see here. And then you blow it to the full size, the 2 layers stick together, wait for it to cool down over a few days, and then you get a gem cutting tool and cut the white glass off and create these amazing, beautiful scenes. And this would have been enormously expensive and probably made for the emperor or member of the imperial family themselves. People always ask what the scene is, what's going on. I'm going to concentrate on this side first. And you can see this is a love story. Here's Cupid with his bow and arrow, so you don't need to be a classical expert to know that. And the normal love story that it's said to be is the story of Peleus and Thetis, the parents of the great hero Achilles of the Trojan War. And this is his father, Peleus, who had been chosen to marry the goddess Thetis. And here we have Thetis on the other side, lying on a rock by the sea. She was one of the Nereids, one of the sea goddesses. And the story was that it'd been prophesied that her son would outshine his father, be greater than his father. So all the gods backed off very quickly. They didn't want to have a son greater than them. So it's okay if young Peleus did. And he's being encouraged to go around to the other side of the vase, Thetis, by her mother. This figure here is Doris, the sea goddess. And it's thought that this snake is actually a sea snake called a Ketos. And that's what's happening here. There's another theory that it's actually members of Augustus's family. And in fact, this is Augustus with his sister Octavia, who's looking rather mournful because she's been abandoned by her husband, Mark Antony. And this is Mark Antony because he's been seduced by Cleopatra. And this is not Doris, but Cleopatra. Well, you pay your money and take your choice. I don't know which it is, but it's a rather wonderful story. And in the next slide, I've just shown the handles. You don't usually see these. And you've got these wonderful marks on the handles, and you'll see the other figures around here. Now, this was this was first discovered in the 16th century by Cardinal Barberini, having been buried in the tomb of the Empress Severus Alexander back in 235, stayed there for over 1,000 years. And it was known for about 200 years as the Barberini vase. And it was then owned in the 18th century by the Countess Palestrina, who was an inveterate gambler, and she was terrible. She lost a huge amount of money, so had to sell off the family treasure. She sold this to William Hamilton, the famous British collector, for £1,000, which in the 1780s was a lot of money. When he got it back to England, he sold it to Margaret, Duchess of Portland, who was the richest person in England, so it's nothing to her, £1,000. And it was her son, the third Duke of Portland, sometime Prime Minister of this country, who lent it to his great friend Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, who spent about a year trying to copy this in his pottery and successfully did it and started producing lots of jasperware based on this, either blue and white or black and white. And good job he did, because in 1845, disaster struck and the vase was smashed by a drunkard into 187 pieces, and you can see a watercolour of the pieces. And John Doubleday, one of the employees at the museum, was given the problem of gluing them back together again, and a very difficult task, and he managed it. And part of the way he managed it is because Wedgwood had made these wonderful copies that he could work out where all the different pieces went. So very lucky that that had happened. The museum still didn't own it at that time. It was only on loan from the Dukes of Portland. And it was 100 years later, in 1945, that they bought it. And when they bought it in 1945, they realised that the glue was coming apart, and they had to take it apart and re-glue it. And the glue they used in 1945 wasn't that good, because 40 years later, in the 1980s, it was coming apart again, and they had to take it apart another time and glue it up again. So it had a rather rough life before Portland vase. We're now going right down to the end of this row of galleries to room 61, to Nebarmun, and we're going right back in time to the ancient Egyptians here, to the year 1365 BC, when Nebarmun was buried in this wonderful wall painting. The museum has 11 fragmentary wall paintings from his tomb, and they date from a period just before what we call the Amarna period, when Akhenaten was pharaoh and produced the most amazing realistic art. And it's starting to happen even at this period. Now, Nebarmun himself, as you can see, is not that realistic. He's the typical Egyptian style, with part of his body in profile, part of it in full face, and you can see which bit is which. And the convention of having the most important figure, the largest, Nebarmun himself there, his wife less important, so she's smaller, and then their daughter between Nebarmun's legs is even smaller. And the hieroglyphs on this tell us exactly who he was. He was the scribe and grain accountant in the granary in the tomb of Amun. So he worked for the priests of Amun, collecting and counting the grain. And he must have made a fortune from this, because his tomb is so elaborate, these beautiful paintings. And they show him hunting, as they do in this scene. They show him enjoying banquets, counting up his treasure, counting up his goods from his land. He must have owned a lot of land with farms on it. Sitting in his garden, enjoying the fountains in his pond, and it's a wonderful set of paintings. So I'll just have a little closer look at Nebarmun himself. And you can see he's a pretty good hunter. He's already caught 3 birds in one hand, and then he's got a throwing stick with a snake on it to go try and catch some more birds. You can see the beautiful hieroglyphs behind, and we'll come to the story of hieroglyphs later when we look at the Rosetta Stone. And just going to focus in on the birds. And as I say, the realism is starting to appear in Egyptian art at this period, and you can actually recognize certain species, such as a egret, pied wagtail, and a shrike. And I'll let you try and work out which of those is which. Just to give you a clue, that's what a egret, pied wagtail, and a shrike look like. And further down the picture, you may have noticed this rather wonderful cat. Just focusing on the cat. You can't quite see it. His eyes are picked out with gold leaf, because cats were very important in the ancient Egyptians, partly for hunting, partly as domestic pets, presumably very important for a grain accountant, for keeping down the mice in the grain stores, but also worshipped as goddesses. You can see he's a brilliant hunter. He's caught 1 bird in his beak, another one in his front paws, another one in his back paws. How he's going to land with all those birds in him, I don't quite know. Anyway, he's a pretty good game. And there's just a close-up here of Nebarmun's wife, who's called Hatshepsut, her most amazing headdress. I'm not quite sure the significance of these. And she's holding some lotus flowers. And then between his legs, as I say, is his daughter. Now, she's very small, but it's a rather tender gesture the way she's holding onto her father's leg for safety while he's going around hunting. And she's also got some lotus flowers which she picked from the pond. And underneath in the river, you can even see the fish. This is a tilapia fish that's been depicted. Now we're going down the north stairs now, hurrying down to the Ho Tung Gallery. And the first thing I want to look at in the Ho Tung Gallery is this figure. When you get into the Ho Tung Gallery, on the left you've got the Indian subcontinent pieces, and on the right you've got the Chinese pieces. And the first thing you see in the Indian subcontinent is this wonderful figure of Shiva, Shiva Nataraja, and he dates to the 11th century, so he's about 1,000 years old, made from bronze. It comes from South India, part of the Kola culture of South India. And he's shown as the cosmic dancer. Here he is sustaining his rhythm, the Tandava, dancing the universe into existence and waiting for it to be made extinct. There's a couple of images of the front and back, which is a wonderful thing, because it was, you have to see both front and back because he was used in processions. Again, I'll just focus in a bit. You can see at the base there's some holes in the base which go all the way through, and he would have been put on poles and at certain festivals and paraded around the streets near the temple where he was. You can see he's got 4 arms, and this hand here is up in a gesture called the Gaja Mudra, the Abhara Mudra, which signifies fearlessness. The other hand is pointing down to this foot, which is raised, and this is the Gaja Mudra, which represents the release or bestowing of grace and refuge for devotees. And he's surrounded by flames, which are all part of creation and destruction. He's got 2 different earrings on, which represent male and female manifestations. Now I'm going to focus on the next 2 hands, the other 2 hands. You can see in one hand he's holding a drum, and this is what he used to beat creation into existence. This is the Damara Mudra. And the other hand he's holding a flame, which is symbolizing the end of creation, the destruction of creation, when everything will be burnt to a cinder. And his foot, the one foot that's standing, is on this little creature here, who's called Apasmara, who signifies ignorance and delusion. He's being crushed by Shiva's foot. So he's being told that he can't interfere with creation, hopefully. Now, if we turn around and go to the other side of the Ho Tung Gallery, we get to the Chinese section, and we see the Tang dynasty figures. See them right in the middle of the gallery. And if I come up a bit closer, you can see there's 12 figures from a tomb, a Tang dynasty tomb. Tang dynasty lasted from the beginning, near the beginning of the 7th century AD, right up to the beginning of the 10th century AD, so about 300 years. And one of the most significant dynasties, early China, had very extensive diplomatic relationships with other countries all over Asia. And this is reflected in their artwork and their pieces like this. The very rare, a lot of these tomb figures survive, but it's very rare to get a full set from one particular tomb. And this is the tomb of a general called Liu Tingzun, who died in 728. So we can date this pretty accurately to that date. They would have been fairly common in the sense that they were molded, so other people would have had these as well, but to have 12 of them like this shows that he was a pretty important person. Unfortunately, he's left us his obituary. Very kind of him to write his own obituary, so that we know from that not only was he probably the best general who's ever lived, but he's also one of the most successful civil servants and governors who ever lived. He's a very modest man, telling us all these wonderful things about himself. But even without that, we can tell he's successful from these amazing figures. And they come from all over the Chinese empire and places that they were in touch with, like Japan and other parts of Central Asia. All the places along the Silk Route, right over to what's now Persia and so on in the Western Asia. The tomb also contain other goods such as paper models and silver and gold and silks and lacquers, and these haven't survived in the same way that these wonderful figures do. They're painted, you can see, in three colours. This is known as Sansai, these three colours, glazes, yellow, green and brown. Unfortunately, their technique for firing these wasn't that sophisticated, and the colours often used to run. So wherever there's a human face, you can see the human faces, they didn't put any of the colours on because you didn't want nasty streaks on the faces, but it's right on the animals and mythological figures. So I'm going to concentrate on each of these figures in turn, going through the tomb. I should just say that these were used actually in the funeral procession itself, when the general was buried and then left outside the entrance of the tomb as his family came to grieve him, and then they would have been put inside the tomb. So again, later on when they came to celebrate the general's life and talk to his spirit, these figures would be there for them to see as well. So going to the first group, these first two figures, these you can see are mythological type figures. They're earth spirits, and then behind them you've got two guardian figures, two heavenly guardian figures who are more human but still pretty fearsome looking, and they're there to ward off, all of these are there to ward off evil spirits trying to attack the soul of the general. These two figures, the guardian figures, show a Buddhist influence, so they're in touch with India, showing that, and they're standing on the backs of cows, which perhaps almost suggests a Hindu influence as well. And if you go to the next pair of figures, you've got two civil servants looking very self-important, very grand, and this is because the general assumed that in the afterlife he'd be just as important as he was in this life, and he'd need these civil servants to help him organise whatever area of the afterworld he was in charge of. So he had to have those with him in his tomb. And you can just see the first of the grooms. There's two grooms, and in the first group he's got two horses, splendid horses, beautifully decorated. These are not Chinese horses. The Chinese horses at that date were small and fairly insignificant breeds. So these are imported from somewhere in Central Asia, which had much better horses, much bigger. And you can see in relation to the groom, they are huge. And then the final two figures with another groom here are camels, the double humps of the Bactrian camels, again imported from Central Asia, from Afghanistan or somewhere like that. So coming out of the Houghton Gallery, room 33, we go down the steps back to the ground floor, and the main gallery we see in front of us is room 24, which is Living and Dying. And if you go through there, you can see the back of this wonderful figure. And this is, we used to call this chap Hoa Hakananea, but we know now, because we had a visit from Rapa Nui officials, he should be called Hoa Hakananaea. So Hoa Hakananaea, to try and remember to pronounce it correctly. And he's an example of an Easter Island or Rapa Nui moai, one of these amazing figures that Easter Island is famous for. He's a small one. He's only 9 feet tall. You can see some of the people around him, give you an idea of his height. There probably were originally about 1,000 of these on Rapa Nui. There's now 887 known. And the average height is between 10 and 20 feet. The tallest one is 32 feet. And there was one that they abandoned, never finished, still in the quarry, which if they had finished would have been 68 feet tall. So that's why I say he's small at only 9 feet. He's also unusual in that he's made of basalt, which is a very hard rock to work, whereas most of them are made of tuff, which is a much softer volcanic material. There's only about a dozen or so made from basalt. So he's a rather special one of these moai. Now, Rapa Nui is one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. It's one of the most remotest inhabited islands. It's 745 miles from the nearest islands, the Marichal Islands, which is probably where the original settlers came from. It's over 1,000 miles from the nearest mainland, the mainland of South America. And we're not quite sure when settlers first got there, somewhere between 300 and 800 AD. And they flourished when they got to Rapa Nui, and the population got to about 10,000 at its height. Today it's much less than that, but it was a very successful community. And they started putting up these amazing statues round about the year 1100, and I say altogether about 1,000 were put up. They were carved from the rock in the middle of the island, the volcanic rock, and then transported to the edge of the island and put on plinths with their backs to the sea. So it's like the right-hand side here. And then round about 1600, they stopped doing this. And the reason we think is because they'd run out of trees. They'd chopped down every tree in the centre of the island, and they said there's no way of getting them to the edge anymore. They also, rather foolishly, had killed all the birds that lived in those trees. So they'd run out of a good source of protein, and they had to find another source. And they did this by finding the birds that nested in the rocks off the coast of Rapa Nui, and they changed their religion. They started pulling these statues down or burying them, and this particular one was moved to a hut and turned round, and you can see on the back of the statue here, it was recarved with two seabirds here, boobies or some sort of other seabird, beak to beak, and then above them there's a little egg with a chick coming out of. This was part of this new worship, this new cult they had, so he got a second life. And they were still using this new cult in 1722 when the aliens landed. I mean, it wasn't really aliens, but to them it must have seemed like it, because as far as the people there knew, they were the only people in the world. They had no contact with any other people. And then suddenly a Dutch ship arrived on Easter Day, hence the name Easter Island, 1722. And as soon as they had contact with the outside world, this was a disaster. They suddenly started to get diseases that they had no resistance to. The population started to plummet. When Captain Cook got there in the 1770s, he said the population was down to less than 1,000. He probably got that wrong, but it was still very poor. And rescue came in 1868. Now, I'll just show you the next slide. This is the hut that he was found in. In 1868, the British ship HMS Topaz was sent there, and the captain of the ship, a man called Richard Powell, brought with him supplies, medical supplies, farming supplies, which helped the people, and he wanted something in return. So he asked them, could I have one of your lovely statues? And they seemed to all have been abandoned. They weren't part of the cult anymore. And they found him a rather tatty one, which he wasn't very pleased with. He said, no, I want a really nice one. So they said, well, there's one in this, there's a head of one poking out from the rubble in this hut. And so they dug it out, and he found this rather beautiful Hoa Hakanana Ia. And he said to them, what's its name? And they didn't quite understand what he meant. He said, and they said, Hoa Hakanana Ia. So he took that as a name, but in fact, what they were probably saying was, why are you stealing our statue? Because Hoa Hakanana Ia means something like hidden or stolen friend. So anyway, he brought it back to England, offered it to Queen Victoria, and she didn't really have anywhere to put it, so she gave it to the British Museum. And it's been one of the star attractions of the museum ever since. We're now popping down to the Africa Gallery, room 25. So down the stairs and turn right into the Nigerian section, and to these amazing bronzes. This is a bronze head of Queen Idia, dates from the 16th century. Now, bronze casting seems to have been invented lots of times all over the world in different cultures, and the people of Benin, where this comes from, were particularly good at it. And the new palace was being built in the 16th century for the king, the Oba Essegie, who was an exact contemporary of Henry VIII, and his mother had been very helpful to him to get to power and defeating his enemies. So when she died, he had this portrait made of her and put on a plinth by her palace where she lived next to his, so that everyone could come and see it. And it is a spectacular piece of work. Now, they were very good at bronze making, and some of the other pieces include this panel and this water jug in the form of a leopard. Just to prove it is a leopard, if you look closer, you can see the spots on the leopard. And here we have the Oba himself with leopards. Again, you see the spots, because only they thought the leopard was the king of the beasts, and only the Oba, the king, could actually sacrifice leopards. Nobody else was allowed to kill leopards. But this panel comes from a decoration from the walls of the palace, which they were taken down, and in the end of the 19th century, when Nigeria was part of the British Empire, after the scramble for Africa, and virtually the whole of Africa had been divided up between European countries, Nigeria got in the British Empire. The then Oba wasn't happy to accept being part of the empire. When a couple of British officials were sent to him to negotiate something, he killed them. And you didn't do that to British officials in 1897, so an expeditionary force was sent. to teach them a lesson. And when they found all these panels in a storeroom about to be melted down, they thought, oh, we would have those. They brought them back to the British Museum, and they tell a wonderful story of the history, the 16th century history of the Benin people. They didn't have a written history, so it's from these panels that you can tell what happened. We're coming back to the ground floor now, turning right past the Hoa Hakanana into the North American Gallery, room 26. And you can see most of the things in here are fairly typical of Canada and the United States. You can see a rather unassuming drum just here, and I want to look at that. This is known as the Akan drum. And this was acquired by Sir Hans Sloane, the founder of the museum. The bust you can see is Sloane in room 1, a wonderful terracotta bust by Michael Reisbach. And he acquired it from the Reverend Clark, who had bought it in Virginia in 1730. And Reverend Clark assumed this was a North American drum. And in fact, he was correct in that the drum skin is from a North American deer. And Sloane put it in his collection, and it was for a long time it thought to be a North American drum, until fairly recently, people looked at it a bit closer and realised that the wood and the design couldn't possibly have come from North America. They came from West Africa, from the Akan region of West Africa. So it seems to tell us a story of its own about the awful slave trade. Some 12 million African slaves transported across the Atlantic over about 300 years, from the 16th to the 19th century, which Britain was part of, quite a successful part of. And it appears that although many of the slaves were transported in the most appalling conditions, some had slightly better conditions, and the captains of the ship used to try and exercise the slaves to keep them healthy and well. And sometimes these drums then from their native country were used to sort of beat a rhythm so that they could dance to it or exercise to it. Occasionally, they were the possessions of a prince, the son of the African chieftain who'd actually enslaved the people and sold them to the Western merchants. And he went with them to make sure that his father wasn't being diddled, I suppose, or to see where they were going. So one or the other, it got to America, and quite a lot of the plantation owners allowed the slaves on the plantation to keep musical instruments when in their time off, at night when they weren't working, to practice dancing, until the early 18th century, when they realized that they might have been using these to communicate with each other, and a number of coordinated slave revolts happened. So that's probably when it was sold to the Reverend Clark and brought it over to England. So it's got a fascinating story of this rather extraordinary story of slavery that's so important to know about in our history. So we're going next door now to the Mexican Gallery and looking at these two lintels. They come from the Maya people, and we can date these pretty exactly. The Mayans were one of the greatest civilizations of Central America. They come from Yaxchiclan in Quipus in Mexico. And there were actually 3 originally, but we've got just these 2 from a complex built by Shield Jaguar the Great. You can see the glyphs. You can see the glyphs at the top of the lintel here. And there's Shield Jaguar the Great, who was king for about 60 years, very successful. And we can date these to the 24th of October, 709, so again, very early on. And the paint has disappeared. You can see traces of turquoise and red paint up here. But this would have been a quite spectacular piece. There's Shield Jaguar the Great in all his finery with a gold medallion, Quetzal bird feathers in his headdress, holding a flaming torch. He's even got a shrunken head in his headdress up here. Kneeling before them is his queen, his favourite queen, Queen Cabelzuk. Again, wonderful headdress and gold medallion and splendid costumes. And she's doing something rather gruesome. I hope everyone's got a strong stomach, haven't just been eating, because what she's got is a rope with thorns in it, and she's pulling them through her tongue, through a hole in her tongue. Very nasty. But she's doing this for her husband's sake, and we can see what happened next in the second panel. Poor Queen Cabelzuk has almost fainted with the pain of this, and she's now having a hallucination. And from the bowl where her blood's been collected, there's a serpent writhing up in front of her. And you can see he's opened his jaws out from his jaws appears her husband's ancestor, the spirit of her husband's ancestor, the founder of his dynasty. And she had to do this to reinforce her husband's right to be king, because like all peoples at this time, the same as in Africa and in Britain at the same time, the Anglo-Saxon period, there were lots of little kingdoms all fighting each other. So she had to do that for her husband's sake. Now, before you think, poor woman, you know, they're really horrid men making their queens do this, I should just mention in passing that the king also had to do something very similar with a rope with thorns in it, pass through a fleshy part of his body, but it wasn't his tongue. I'll leave it to your imaginations to work out what it was. So we're now going into room 1, the Enlightenment Gallery. This is one of the most beautiful rooms in the museum, and it's the oldest part of the museum. Though the museum was founded in 1753, the original building has long since disappeared. This room was built in the 1820s to hold the library of King George III. When George III died in 1820, his son George IV was not much of a reader and wanted to rehouse his father's library, 65,000 books, and so gave them to the museums. They had to build this beautiful room, which is still considered one of the most beautiful rooms in London. And until 1998, it held a large part of the museum's library. And then when the British Library moved out up to St Pancras, they had to find something else to do with it, and they turned it into the Enlightenment Gallery. And it tells the story of the 18th century when everything was being examined, re-examined, including ancient languages. One of the sections about ancient languages. And we're going to look at the Rosetta Stone, which is in this gallery. I'll show you where it is in a moment. Now, when I was a child, the Rosetta Stone used to be like it is here in the Egyptian Sculpture Gallery, room 4, and there was a bar around it, but you could actually get up quite close and touch it. Now it's behind a reinforced glass screen and you can't get very close to it. So we can't really talk about it there. There's always too many people around it. It's much easier to talk about it in the Enlightenment Gallery, and there it is in this copy. Now, most things they don't touch. This one actually says, please touch, so you can actually touch the Rosetta Stone. And it's a decree, a rather boring decree from 196 BC, when Egypt was ruled by Greeks, the Ptolemies, and it's in 3 languages. So if I get closer to it, you can see the 3 languages here. At the top, you've got Egyptian hieroglyphs with the cartouches spelling out the royal names. In the center, you've got the everyday language of the Egyptian people. And at the bottom, you've got Greek. So when the Ptolemies put up proclamations, they couldn't read or understand Egyptian. They had to have everything in Greek. So there it is. The local people couldn't speak Greek, so they had to have it in Egyptian. And the priest said, well, everything else in Egypt for the last 2,000 years plus has been in hieroglyphs as well, so they had to go into hieroglyphs. Now, very fortunate for us, because when this was found in 1799 by Napoleon scientists. Napoleon invaded Egypt about that period, and he took 167 scientists and artists and so on with him, told them to go and look for things, and they found this. Why isn't it in the Louvre? Well, it's not in the Louvre because his army lost to the British Army, so it came to Britain and given to George III, who gave it to the British Museum, so anyone could come and study it for free. And it was a British scholar called Thomas Young who first worked out that the areas in the cartouches, to show those again, these areas here, spell out the names of Ptolemy and the other Greek members, and they're done phonetically with letters. Now, but he couldn't work out the rest of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And in fact, it was a Frenchman, ironically, Jean-Francois Champollion, who worked out that the other symbols are not letters. It's not an alphabetic language like most modern languages. It contained some letters, some symbols which you didn't pronounce, others that you did pronounce. Very complex, and he worked out about 2,000 words using this amazing thing. And it's because of this that we now read all Egyptian hieroglyphs. Right, quickly racing on. We're crossing behind the reading room to room 10C to see these colossal winged balls. And these date, again, fairly exactly to the years 710 to 705 BC, and they come from Khorsabad and the palace of Sargon II of Assyria. I'll just close in on one of them. This is one of these amazing things. And Sargon II, or Sharrukin as he called himself, Sargon is the name we have in the Bible, decided to move the capital from the old capital of Nimrod to a new city, which he named after himself, Dur Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon, the fortress of Sharrukin. And every part of it had these, every entrance had these wonderful figures. And this is generally thought, although the Syrian Empire lasted about 300 years, from about 900 to 600 BC, these are thought to be the height of their culture, the height of their artwork. But even then, they are winged human-headed bulls, which is not very realistic, but even less realistic is that they've got 5 legs. You've got 2 legs at the front, and then you've got, if you look at the side, they've got 4 legs walking, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't quite understand that, but they are amazing things. They're the 2 of the heaviest things in the museum, quite spectacular. Just go on to the next slide, you can see the head of this winged bull, probably Sargon's face himself, and at the back you've got this figure of a priest, this rather nifty little handbag. It's actually a bucket, and he's got a pine cone, and he's sprinkling the figure with holy water. And these are there to ward off enemies, but they would have had palace guards as well. And just down the bottom here, you can't quite see it, I've got a rather poor image of it here. You can see that somebody has scratched a gaming board into the ledge, which is the game of 20 squares, or sometimes known as the royal game of Ur. And up in the upper galleries, Mesopotamian galleries, we have a beautiful game of Ur from about 1500 years earlier than this, so it's still being played in Sargon's time. And what we think is that the palace guards got so fed up with waiting for people to come and see the king that they scratched this in the side. Probably were told off mercilessly. I can't imagine they were really allowed to do it. But it's a nice personal touch. And finally, we come to the Parthenon sculptures. Now, just to prove that I do tours in there, I thought I'd include this slide of me doing a tour, which was done for a magazine article about 20 years ago. So my hair is not quite as grey as it is now. And the Parthenon sculptures, again, some of those famous pieces in the museum, built after the Persian invasions, after the Persians attacked Athens in 480 BC and burnt the Parthenon to the ground. So it had to be rebuilt, and it was rebuilt in a splendid way with these superb sculptures. And for example, you've got a series around the walls of these horsemen, sometimes thought to be athletes from the Panathenaic Games, a bit like the Olympic Games, getting ready to go take part of the Great Panathenaia, the festival once every 4 years in honour of Athena, the patron of Athens. And the climax of this festival is called the presentation of the Peplos. And here you can see in the middle of the East frieze, this child with this huge cloak, giving it to the Archon Basileus, the chief magistrate of Athens, in the presence of the gods and goddesses. There's Athena herself with her brother Hephaestus, totally disinterested in it. I must say, she got the same birthday present every 4 years. She's got a new Peplos every 4 years, so a bit boring. But what do you buy, goddess? You know, she probably knows before you've made it what you're making anyway. She can foretell the future. But anyway, they still carried on with this. And one of the interesting things about these sculptures is that on the other side of this group, you've got her father, Zeus. I'll just highlight Zeus. And you can see he's talking to his wife, Hera. He's the only one that gets a throne. All the others are sitting on stools, including Athena. He's got a back to his throne and an armrest with a little sphinx under it. And when they built the Parthenon, the Temple of Zeus, the chief temple of Zeus, was being built at Olympia. And they made the Parthenon just that bit bigger, 1 column longer, 1 column wider than Zeus's temple, which is an insult, really, to your chief god. So they thought, well, if we give him a throne, he'll forgive us. He didn't. Before the Parthenon was finished, the Athenians were fighting a civil war against the Spartans, which they lost. Perhaps if they hadn't insulted him, they might have won it. I don't know. Anyway, that's the end of the tour. We've overrun the time slightly, I'm afraid. And I just thought again with this nice image I took a couple of years ago of the British Museum in the snow. Let's hope we see it again before it starts snowing on the museum. Okay, thank you very much. Apologies for overrunning, but just a minute over. So.